You're in Braves country.
Hey, howdy, hi, and how the hell are you? Welcome in Braves Country Radio. Now, even though this is Braves Country Radio, we're going to talk a little more than our typical Atlanta Braves as we continue our Once Upon a Pastime series. And this is the World Series segment that we're doing. And this is Game 3, as we're calling these. We're going to do 7 different parts. So this is part 3, Game 3, as we're calling it, of our World Series content. And looking forward to this one. Took some time to break down the numbers. And what we're going to do today is talk about, we're going to compile the greatest World Series team of all time. And when I say that, I am referring to, we're going to take the best catcher, the best first baseman, second baseman, on and on and on, and even develop a pitching staff. We're going to do that in this episode, and we're going to talk about their career. This isn't necessarily my favorite players. This isn't necessarily your favorite players. This isn't necessarily the best players to ever have played the game, because you would have had to step up in a big moments. Big moment is not enough. Big moments in the World Series. Now, granted, when you talk about this, we are going to lean with an all-time great over a guy whose career may have been a little meh when it's all said and done. If that's the deciding factor, if you got two guys that were right there neck and neck, we went with the all-timer, the Hall of Famer, right? And so that's where we're at. We do have, let me see, there's at least one current player in there. Actually, 2 technically. I don't believe the second gentleman has officially retired yet. And one of the guys just recently won a World Series. And basically his numbers jump off the absolute page, and it's kind of hard to ignore them. So let's go ahead and do this without further ado. Let's get into the first baseman of the World Series.
You're in Braves country.
All-time first base. Before we hit that, we're going to lop this in there with it, the designated hitter, because the designated hitter rule is actually a rule that is now in play in Major League Baseball, and it's not going anywhere. We did put a designated hitter in as well. And the guy that we picked for the designated hitter, I don't think anybody can ignore his stats. Now look, I'm not ignoring the fact that he was implicated in the steroid era. I don't think his faults were as egregious as others. I think he probably took something, tested positive, and that was the end of it. Because if you just look at the guy, he doesn't look like a guy who spent a whole lot of time roiding up in the gym. But I do acknowledge that. So if anyone has a problem with him being as the designated hitter role, I get it. We would love to hear your opinion. You pick your best guy. But my best guy has got to be David Ortiz, Big Papi, as they affectionately call him in Boston. And when you look at his overall numbers, David Ortiz, his numbers just cannot be ignored. His career was phenomenal across the board, but who had better big-time moments in the postseason than David Ortiz? David Ortiz, his postseason batting average was .289 with a .947 OPS. He played in 85 games, and in those 85 games had 17 home runs. So when you really look at it, David Ortiz didn't have an extraordinary career per se in the postseason, but man, did he step in big moments in the World Series. He was the 2013 World Series MVP. He was the 2004 MVP. He had some of the biggest games in the history of this sport, and I just don't think it would be a very legitimate argument. You look at this, if nothing else. In the World Series alone, one World Series, the 2013 World Series, David Ortiz hit 688 and 25 plate appearances. That was the one that was what, their third championship in that run. You had the one in 04, you had the one in, was it 7, 13, and then of course in 18. So that alone makes him stand out. But his batting average in his career in the World Series, 455, and that can't be ignored. So David Ortiz is our designated hitter, and we move on from that. Our first baseman is the great Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig had 10 home runs. 10 home runs, the most by anyone who had a minimum of 100 plate appearances in the World Series. Lou Gehrig had a 1214 lifetime OPS in the World Series. By the way, David Ortiz, his slugging was 795. That was good enough for 6th all time. Now, Barry Bonds had a very good World Series. The problem is it is such a small sample size. So I had a hard time, and we kind of threw the steroids out in this particular argument. Typically, when we're talking Hall of Fame or whatnot, folks know my leaning. I believe they don't belong in. But when you're talking about something like this, I didn't hold that against Barry Bonds. That's not why Barry Bonds isn't my designated hitter. That's not why Barry Bonds isn't in my outfield. Barry Bonds, first of all, didn't win a championship. That's number one. That's first and foremost. Number two, he only had 30 plate appearances in his World Series career. That's just not enough. Just like Troy Glaus, who had a very good World Series, but only had 30 plate appearances. Willie Aikens had an 1,100 slugging percentage. 1,100. But he only had 26 plate appearances. Amos Otis, 957. So really difficult to put them in. But Lou Gehrig gets the nod at first base. When you look at Lou Gehrig and you look at his statistics in the postseason, he had 10 home runs in 119 at-bats. Obviously, all of his at-bats in the postseason were in the World Series. This is long before you had divisions and wild card and whatnot. 35 RBIs in those 34 games. And he had an OPS of what, 11, just over 1,200, 1,214 to be exact. 87 total bases. And for my money, Lou Gehrig and all of his World Series championships, he gets the nod. He won 7. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 World Series. I'm sorry. He won. He technically won the World Series in 1939. He did not play in it. So he technically would have been on 6 World Series championship teams, getting those 34 games in. He also played in another one in 1926 where they did not win the World Series. They lost the World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals. I believe that was in 7 games as well. So looking at what he did, and look, the 1928 World Series, I know everyone always wants to talk about the 27 Yankees. The 1928 World Series, he had 4 home runs, 9 RBIs in a 4-game sweep of the St. Louis Cardinals. That was right before the Gas House Gang really took off. In the 1932 series, that was the famous one against Chicago, he had 3 home runs in 4 games. So in back-to-back World Series appearances, 28 and 32, he had 7 home runs in 8 games. There's never been a better first baseman to do it. And so we stick with the great Lou Gehrig as our guy for first base, and David Ortiz obviously is the second baseman. All right, moving on. The next one.
You're in Braves country.
All right, the next one, we're going to second base. And with second base, there were a lot of really good candidates. And I know some of the newer folks would probably lean, I'm going to guess a lot of folks would want to see Jose Altuve, and he gets a nod as a secondary. He'd be my first second baseman off the bench. I'll put it that way. But honestly, I took a couple of things into consideration. A, the guy we gave it to was an absolute legend in the World Series, and he did it the right way. And I had to go with a guy in the name of Joe Morgan, who was on the Big Red Machine, that did it the right way. And you talk to folks, he's just before my time. I saw the tail end of his career, but I would be lying to you if I said that I remember Joe Morgan's career and I remember how he played, right? That's not the case. I remember Joe Morgan more as a Philadelphia Philly at the end of his career than I do his actual Cincinnati Reds days, which was at his absolute apex, right? But he won the World Series in 75 and in 76. They won back-to-back series in 75 and 76. Remember, they were also in the World Series in 1972 with Joe Morgan, where they lost to the great Oakland Athletics teams. Of course, those are the Vita Blue, the Reggie Jackson teams. But you look at what he did in his career. First of all, he had in his career in the World Series, let's go to that first. Joe Morgan had 3 home runs in those 3 World Series. He had a 792 OPS, which was extremely good back in that time period for a second baseman. And then the other thing would be, if you're looking at this, Joe Morgan was the catalyst that really, if you want to talk about those great Cincinnati Reds teams, he was really the guy that he was the straw that stirred the drink for that offense. He was very solid defensively as well, but we really leaned more on offense with this list. We left out guys like Ozzie Smith, who had great defensive World Series, but didn't necessarily do a whole lot at the plate. Joe Morgan was an absolute star for that team. And he has been most people believe that he is the greatest second baseman to ever play. From all the numbers I see, I honestly can't argue it. But like I said, I only saw the tail end of his career. I saw him when he and the Philadelphia Phillies lost to the Baltimore Orioles in '83. That's really my biggest recollection of Joe Morgan in playoffs. So everything that happened in the 70s, don't really remember it, but you go to the numbers and you look how impressive that he was in those World Series. Especially in the World Series in 1976 against the Yankees, where he batted .333, had a home run, had 2 stolen bases in 4 games, 17 plate appearances. And that was really the defining moment of the Big Red Machine. You got to remember something about the Big Red Machine. One of the things that adds to their legend is if you look at who they beat. So they beat the Red Sox in one of the most dramatic World Series of all time, especially if you just go to Game 6 and Game 7, 2 phenomenal games. But then to top it off, the following year, they sweep the New York Yankees. So in back-to-back years, you beat the 2 of the teams that have the biggest fan bases in all of sports. You do it back-to-back, and this was back when baseball was still king. The NFL was coming with the Super Bowl, and it was really starting to catch momentum, but the World Series was still king at this point. And the fact that he did it on the biggest of stages really lends to who he was as a player. The great Joe Morgan is our second baseman. And I don't think a lot of folks would argue with that. Like I said, we'll put an asterisk on Altuve and have him first second baseman, first infielder off the bench. But because of the cheating, I've got to lend it to Joe Morgan. You can't just look away from the fact that he knew what kind of pitch was coming in a lot of his early at-bats. But that's not why we left Altuve off. We left Altuve off because Joe Morgan is just an all-time great. And, of course, has the 2 legitimate World Series championships to prove it. All right. The next guy here on the list. All right, we're going to go with the third base. This one was a pretty difficult one to choose from, but we went along and took a gentleman who we just lost recently. We went with the great Brooks Robinson. Brooks Robinson won the World Series in 1966. He was the World Series MVP in 1970. That was the one where they beat the Cincinnati Reds. And remember something, too, about Brooks Robinson. He is infamous for that great backhanded stab that he makes down the third base line, then throws out the runner across the diamond. I mean, he's literally sitting in the dugout in today's game. Such a incredible throw. The great Brooks Robinson. He is our third baseman. Now, Brooks Robinson, couple things about him, had an OPS up around 700, 3 home runs. Pete Rose is a very close second for me. Pete Rose takes just a little bit of a backseat to Brooks, mainly because Rose was always known for what? Getting on base and whatnot. He only has a .269 lifetime batting average in the World Series. Not terrible. Not terrible at all. But if Pete Rose was going to be on that list and be my guy, he would have to be much above 300 for me, just because the lack of power. When you look at Brooks Robinson's overall postseason numbers, just in general, he has a 303 batting average and a 785 OPS. In the 1966 series, didn't have a great year, but he did make some key defensive plays, and he did have a pretty key home run and his only RBI of the series. But in the 1970 series, he had 2 home runs. He had 6 RBIs. And this was a series that only went 5 games. And in that series alone, he had a 1238 OPS, an 810 slug, a batting average of 429. And that's why the great Brooks Robinson and those Baltimore Orioles teams, infamously known as Black Magic, they get their guy in, they get the nod for third base. Shortstop. This one's, I don't think a lot of people are going to expect this one. Might be a little controversial, but let's go ahead and get it. All right, I think the guy that everybody would want to put on here, would probably put on here, would be Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter, you just look at his overall numbers, and he was phenomenal in the postseason. Derek Jeter in the postseason batted 308 lifetime with an OPS of 838, much higher than his career numbers. Derek Jeter in 158 games, but remember, he played in an era where we started getting the expanded playoffs and whatnot, but nonetheless, played in 158 games, and in those 158 games, he had 20 home runs. He had 61 RBI throughout the postseason. And I think we'll always remember him for some of the just dramatic hits that he had. But looking at the World Series, and this is why he's going to get the nod as the first shortstop off the bench for me. And you could make the argument, and it's a fair argument, that you would put him in first. But when I get to the next guy's numbers, you'll understand why I'm leaning towards him. Derek Jeter in the 96 series didn't have a great series. Hit 250, had an OPS of 650, nothing spectacular. Now in the 98 series, he made up for that with an 803 OPS, 353 batting average, but only 1 RBI. In the 99 series, remember that was a short one as well, because the 98 and 99 series, they swept both of them. 801 OPS, 353 batting average. And then in the 2000 series, even though they lost this series, listen to this. He had 409 in that series, 1344 OPS, had 2 home runs, though they lost the series. I'm sorry, the 2000 series, they won that series. That was the one against the Mets. I was thinking of the 2001 World Series. 2001 World Series, where they lose against Arizona, he had a bad World Series. He hit 148. I had those flip-flopped. He hit 148 in the 2001 series, 438 OPS, just abysmal at the plate. So the 2000 series against the Mets, scorching hot, won the MVP. 2001 series fell flat. You get to the 2009 series, and he once again has a very good series. I think he would have won the MVP of the World Series that year, but you had a couple other guys that were just scalding hot. This is the one where they beat Philadelphia in 6. He had a 407 batting average, a 947 OPS, phenomenal World Series. With all that being said, and you can easily make the argument that he should be the number one guy. But then I looked at this guy's numbers, and these are the ones that just absolutely jumped off the board for me. Now, he doesn't have as big of a litmus test, big of a sample size. He's only been in 2 quote unquote World Series. Realistically, only one really counted. But I did not take that away from his numbers. Corey Seager has won 2 World Series MVPs. Now, granted, one of them was the bubble ship, and though we always put an asterisk on it, you can't take away what he personally did. So let's go to the 2020 World Series. Against the Tampa Bay Rays, who, let's be honest, always has a phenomenal offense. And he won the NLCS MVP in 2020 as well. So getting back-to-back MVP awards, even though they were in a bubble, it's still an impressive feat what Corey Seager did. In the 2020 NLCS, he had a .310 batting average and a .1230 OPS. 5 home runs in that NLCS against the Atlanta Braves. Then they take it to the World Series against Tampa Bay. He hits 400 with a .1256 OPS. He had 2 home runs in 13 games in the World Series. I'm sorry, in 13 games in 2020 is what I meant to say. In 13 games in 2020, Corey Seager had 7 home runs. Corey Seager had 16 RBI. You go to the 2023 World Series, and the batting average wasn't as impressive. He hit .286, but the OPS was .1137. He had 3 home runs. 3 home runs in 5 games. 6 RBI. Won the MVP once again. So if you look at the 2 World Series, he's played in 11 World Series games, and he has hit 8 home runs. He has also accounted for, not 8 home runs in the World Series. He has accounted for 5 home runs. I was looking back at the NLCS. 5 home runs, along with, if you count the 2023 and 2020 Championship Series and World Series, listen to these numbers. And though we built this all off of the World Series, but listen to these numbers. This is a guy stepping up in big moments. He's had, 7 to 12 home runs in the 2020 NLCS and World Series, and the 2023 ALCS and World Series. That is unbelievable. So that's why Corey Seager goes to the top of the board. And the fact that he's won 2 MVPs really steps out. Now, you can make the argument, I honestly can't push a whole lot back on putting Derek Jeter there. But Corey Seager's not done. And Corey Seager, when he's had his opportunities, he gives you more pop in that bat. So there we have that. All right. Time to go to the outfield. Oh, the outfield. And of course, there's so many folks to pick from over the years. When you look at the outfield, and it's funny how it's changed over the years. I remember growing up as a kid, the guys in the outfield were typically your boppers. Outfield and first base. The game has changed quite a bit, as we all know. But if we were doing this list 20, 25, 30 years ago, these would be the only main stars with any real pop in their bat would have been your first baseman, obviously designated hitter, and outfield. So when we went to this list, this one was a little more difficult to decipher from. Honestly, when we were going through second base, third and short, there were guys that jumped out, the ones that we've talked about, but then there's a huge drop off. But when you look at this list of guys, and we had to leave so many guys off, and we just won't be able to go into all the guys that we left off. But guys like George Springer, who has had a phenomenal career in the postseason, but I couldn't put him on there. Joe DiMaggio gets left off of this. And Joe DiMaggio is an all-time great, and Joe DiMaggio has won several World Series. But I went with the numbers. Duke Snider was left off this. The great Frank Robinson was left off of this. I just wanted to make sure I named some of these guys. We'll get more into the pitchers that were left off. And you talk about a difficult task to pick a hind catcher. Man alive, was this a difficult one. But let's get in to the first one. I don't think this one shocks anybody. We go to the great Babe Ruth. And by the way, when we go to the pitching, you're going to hear his name again brought up. But the great Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth has been just unbelievable. And that's why it's always laughable to me when you see people try to compare Shohei Ohtani to Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was an elite pitcher and the best batter in the game for about 2 decades. Now, he didn't pitch as long as he batted, obviously, but that was a choice by the team. I think if he would have been allowed to, Babe Ruth, according to a lot of folks, loved pitching, but he knew they were going to pay him more to hit home runs. But here is the great Babe Ruth. First of all, obviously his entire postseason career was done in the World Series. It's very well known, but you didn't start getting divisions until what was it, late 60s? So everything prior to the late 60s was all World Series or bust. This was his career numbers, and this is absurd, in the World Series. He had a total of 41 games played with 167 plate appearances. He had a .326 batting average. He had a .1214 OPS. When he got into the heart of his career, mainly when he got over to the New York Yankees and became a full-time hitter, he only had one down World Series. And that was the 1922 World Series that they lost to the Giants in 5 games. Other than that, the man, can you imagine if they would have been giving out World Series MVPs back then? He would have had them all lined across along with all the other accolades that he did in his career. But listen to these numbers. So we talk about the fact that in his career in the World Series, he bats .1233 OPS. In those, 41 games, he had 15 home runs. But it's even more impressive than that, because you can take 5 of those games out because it was pre-New York Yankees. And pre-New York Yankees, he was essentially a pitcher in those World Series that batted from time to time. Now, they gave him 6 plate appearances in 1918. Prior to that, when he had 5 scattered in the 1916, he had 1 plate appearance in the 1915 World Series. He had a total of 7 World Series championships. 7 out of 10. He won back-to-back World Series in the 27 and 28 seasons. He won back with the Yankees. He won back-to-back World Series in the 15 and 16 seasons with the Boston Red Sox. He won 3 of 4 with the Boston Red Sox, 15, 16, and 18. And he won, was it 3 of 5 years? I guess technically 6 seasons with the Yankees from 27, 28, and then again in 32. 15 home runs in these 41 games. But once again, you can chop about 5 games off of this. With those 5 games, you can chop off about, 12 plate appearances? So we'll say that in 36 games, he had 15 home runs. In just over 150 at bats, 36 games, 15 home runs, 33 RBI. He even had 4 stolen bases. No one ever talks about that. And 33 bases on balls. He only struck out 30 times. Unbelievable. Babe Ruth goes to the top of the board, the 1214 OPS and 15 home runs. And of course, in a pinch, he's in my bullpen. The number 2 outfielder on this list. Sure, it doesn't shock anybody that you're going to get quite a bit of New York Yankees on this list. And our second guy is another New York Yankee. Actually, technically, all 3 of them are. I always think of the third guy as kind of being all over the place. But the great Mickey Mantle. Holy cow, was Mickey Mantle an absolute star in the World Series. Mickey Mantle, in his career, played 65 games in the World Series. He had a 908 OPS, which isn't as phenomenal as you might expect, but not too shabby, especially when you consider the fact that it was scattered over 12 World Series and 14 seasons. So if you think about it, it's a lot easier to have explosive numbers if you only played in the World Series in the prime of your career. But if you played very early in your career where you're still, he was in the World Series at age 19. And then he was also in the World Series at age, 32? But remember, his body broke down on him. For all intents and purposes, in the very first World Series he ever played in, it is believed he probably tore his ACL. Now, back then, they didn't have the modern medicine that they do nowadays and whatnot, but he hurt his knee and he was never the same. Think about what he could have done, but this is what he did, but think about just what he could have done. In those 65 games, this man hit 18 home runs. What? 18 home runs? You're basically talking about being on pace for over 50 home runs if you played a full season of World Series baseball. And realize every time you're in the World Series, this one thing I want to point out with all these guys' numbers, you're going up against the very best. No one gets to the World Series with a Colorado Rockies 2023 pitching staff. You're always going up against the elite. So that's number one. Number two, he played against some really above and beyond the greats of the greats. Remember, he went up against the New York Giants. He played against the famous Giants win the pennant, Giants win the pennant. He was in that series. They beat the New York Giants in 7 games. He went up against the great Brooklyn Dodgers 4 times from 1952 to 1956, and they had phenomenal pitching. They won 3 of those 4. He went up against the Los Angeles Dodgers. Sandy Koufax. He went up against the great St. Louis Cardinals, Bob Gibson. He went up against the elite. He had 18 home runs. When I sat down and broke down these numbers, I understand now why the folks that got a chance to see him play. There's a famous quote by, I think it's Billy Crystal, and he's talking about the folks who always talked about Joe DiMaggio, because I guess that was just before his time, always told him, you never saw the real thing, you never saw Joe. Well, then folks of his generation say the same thing about Mickey Mantle. It's the same thing we would be saying about Mike Trout if he ever had any kind of success in the postseason, but he can't even get to the postseason. If we would have had the ability to see Mike Trout in his prime in the playoffs, what a treat that would have been. I think it's what folks of our generation are going to say about Derek Jeter, and what looks like now it'll be Corey Seager, the fact that guys that step up on the biggest stage. But you look at what Mickey Mantle did, it really is phenomenal. 18 home runs in 65 games. In that stretch, 40 RBI. Now realize one of the reasons why he didn't have a whole lot of RBIs weren't a lot of guys on base, because he had guys hitting all over his lineup that were clearing the bases themselves. He had 43 walks against 54 strikeouts. So he played 65 games and hit 18 home runs and only struck out 54 times. Got to put Mickey Mantle on that list. All right, number 3 that fills out our outfield. Number 3 on this list, and I tried like heck to try to pick someone who didn't play for the New York Yankees, because I feel like this whole thing is going to be a little sordid. But he's really more known for a couple of things. He's known for his 1977 performance with the Yankees, but then prior to that, outstanding performances with the Oakland A's. Remember, before he ever got to 77 and hit those 3 back-to-back home runs, Reggie Jackson had already been an MVP in 1973 with the Oakland A's. They remember something that a lot of folks, you would have either had to be just before Gen X or just at the very, very beginning of Gen X to remember this. That the Oakland Athletics were baseball royalty in the early 1970s. They won 3 World Series back to back to back. They didn't beat Chop Liver. They beat the Dodgers. The 73 Mets were known as a really good team in their own right as well, and they beat the Big Red Machine. Now, he did not play in the 72 World Series, but here are his numbers for his career. Just in the postseason alone, he played in 77 postseason games. Reggie Jackson, the original straw that stirred the drink. Mr. October. You can't, that was my thing, is that when you saw Babe Ruth's numbers and you saw Mickey Mantle's numbers, you couldn't leave them off. For his legacy, I wanted to put Joe DiMaggio on there, but he just gets a great nod as a guy that would be one of the first guys off my bench. But I can't leave a guy whose name was Mr. October out of the all-time lineup. And full disclosure, I was always a big Reggie Jackson fan. Still am. Reggie Jackson was one of the greats to ever do it. And I cannot tell you how great that book is that he and Bob Gibson did together. It was just a question and answer book where the writer of the book just posed questions, and they answered it much like just a give and take, a conversation. And it was some of the best stuff I've ever read, excuse me. I believe it's called 60 Feet, 6 Inches. If you ever get a chance to read that, it is one of the greatest baseball books ever written. No one ever really talks about it. It's phenomenal. Back to Reggie Jackson and what he did. So he won the series in 77 and 78. He won a World Series in 72, just didn't play in the series. 73, 74. So the man altogether had 5 World Series rings. In the postseason, altogether had 18 home runs. But you look at what he did in some of these. The 77 series is just, it's an all-timer. If you ask me who, if I was rating, like if you want to do like a Mount Rushmore of World Series performances, there's a pitcher we're going to talk about in a second that would be on that list. I'm talking about just the one World Series. The 77 Reggie Jackson World Series has got to be there. He had 5 home runs in that 6-game series against the Dodgers. Remember, they were still one of the top, if not the top. By 77, the Super Bowl was starting to overtake the World Series, but it was still there. It really wasn't until the 1980s that the Super Bowl became the enormous draw that it is today. By 77, you're still sitting there as one of the, and I do think that has a lot to do with it, because center stage, you're talking about having cameras in your face, the reporters, et cetera, et cetera. It's a bigger circus when you're a bigger deal. There is no bigger circus than the New York Yankees against the Los Angeles Dodgers in 1977 with all those characters. But you look at that series alone, 5 home runs, 8 RBI, a 450 batting average, 542 on base percentage, and just a ridiculous 1792 OPS. Let that sink in. 1792 OPS. He only had 20 at bats. in the entire series. 24 plate appearances. He scored 10 runs. He had a double, 5 home runs. Just an unbelievable performance, and that's why Reggie Jackson has to be on that list. Time to hit the catchers. All right, here are the catchers. And I went back and forth and back on this because the numbers that Johnny Bench put up in his career in the World Series is pretty darn impressive. Johnny Bench, of course, he'll always be known more than anything else. I think most people that always lean to him as the greatest catcher of all time always point to his defense, his cannon for an arm. But he was a great hitter. I mean, heck, Johnny Bench in his career, which realized would have only been NLCS and World Series. The reason why I always point that out is they're still going up against the elite of the elite. You can go up against some pretty bad pitching in today's playoff and pad some stats in the early rounds. That wasn't the case back then. 1970 to 1979, he was in 49 playoff games. He won 2 World Series. He was the 1976 MVP of the World Series. He had a OPS, by the way, of 1667. A slug of 1133. This was specifically in 1976. His slug for his career in the postseason was 862. He had 2 home runs. A lot of the reasons why it led to his World Series MVP in 76. He had another home run in the 75 championship, the back-to-back years of the Big Red Machine. Johnny Bench was just a phenomenal all-around player. And normally I would say he's the guy. You got to give it to him. And I'm sorry. I'm going to give it to the man who played in 14 World Series, who won 10 World Series, who in his World Series career had 12 home runs. In his own right, he had an OPS of 811. May not be the 863 that Johnny Bench had, but he also had a much bigger sample size. Remember something, too, about Yogi Berra from the stuff that we've done before on the military front. Yogi Berra missed a chunk of his career, early part of his career, fighting in World War II. Yogi Berra was literally boots on the ground at Normandy. He was one of the guys that drove the boats that got the soldiers to and from the ships. But at age 22, he began his career in 1947, winning his first World Series. He won his last World Series in 1962, playing in his last World Series in 1963. For his career, a 274 World Series batter with an 811 OPS, 12 home runs, 39 RBI. All this came within 75 games. So you could kind of point out to the fact that he would have had about 20, and if you played a season of World Series, Yogi Berra would have had himself around 25 or so home runs. Yogi Berra would have had close to 100 RBI. Yogi Berra had a 452 slug and 811 OPS, and Yogi Berra, more than anything else, has 10 World Series rings. 10! There's a funny exchange that folks talk about between Derek Jeter and Yogi Berra. And I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing of it, but basically Jeter's talking to Yogi, and he's pointing out to Yogi that the World Series is more difficult to win nowadays because you have to go through more more rounds. I don't believe that's true. I actually think it was much more difficult to win the World Series years ago because you just have to get hot at the right time nowadays playoffs. Back in Yogi's day, you had to be the best team in your league to qualify. So anyways, you can argue that back and forth, but the point of it is Yogi Berra is talking to Derek Jeter, and Derek Jeter says, I just don't believe that all your World Series, that your 10 World Series championships are as I don't count them as much as I count the ones from today. And Yogi's response was, well, if you don't think they count, you can come by my house anytime you want. You can count all 10 of them. Yogi Berra, not only is he a national treasure because of the way his great quotes and whatnot, everyone skips over this fact. Yogi Berra is the greatest catcher to ever play the game. He was phenomenal defensively. He called the games of these great Yankees teams behind the plate. He called the games. And it led to 10 World Series championships, 10 out of 14 tries. As great as Johnny Bench was, it's absurd to think that anyone was ever better than Yogi Berra. All right, we move on to the pitchers. As we go to put a cap on this, let's get it. All right. By the way, a honorable mention at the catcher position. Obviously, you got Yogi, and then you've got Johnny Bench. Just below that, Tim McCarver. Don't sleep on Tim McCarver. Tim McCarver was a great catcher in his own right. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. And let's get into the first guy on the list. I'm going to go with the great Christy Mathewson. Christy Mathewson played from 1900 to 1916 and was known as the Christian Gentleman. His career was abruptly halted by World War I. He was never the same once he came back. He got hit with mustard gas. But this is what he did in his World Series career. Christy Mathewson won the 1905 World Series with the New York Giants. That was the famous one that came back after the 1903 loss. Or excuse me, the 1903 loss that the National League had, the 1904 snubbing, that's the famous one. That was the one where his manager, McGraw, did not allow his team to participate in the 1904 World Series. By 1905, the owner of the Giants said, you're gonna be involved in this. You can decide whether or not you want to be the manager or not. So in 1905, it was very important to McGraw and the Giants to win that because they didn't show up for the 1904 series. They balked and said, no, we're not going to play it. So in 1905, they win the World Series, and this is one of the greatest performances in the history of sport. Now, you do have to take into consideration during the dead ball era, but listen to these numbers. He pitched in 3 games. In those 3 games, and obviously he would have been MVP if they would have had such a thing back then. He pitched 27 innings, 3 complete games. He did not allow an earned run in the 1905 series. Walked 1, struck out 18, had a whip of .519. That means that his whip was about half of what is considered elite. If you have a whip just over 1, that's an elite whip. No doubt about it. You're keeping guys off the base paths. He had a whip of .51, not 1 point, .51. Unbelievable. He also was in the 1911 World Series, the 1912, and the 1913 World Series. They did not win any of those World Series, but not to the fault of the great Christy Mathewson. Christy Mathewson's lifetime career ERA. Hope you're sitting down. In 11 games, the man had a .97 ERA. 0.97 ERA lifetime. I mean, he really got smacked around in the 1911 series. He had a 2 ERA. What? .94 in 1912, .95 in 1913. Now, something to remember about that, too. He loses to Connie Mack's A's in 2 of those 3 World Series from 1911 to 1913. Connie Mack's A's in the early 1900s were the elite. They were a freight train. Now, that's who they beat in 1905. They had not quite hit that mark yet. But the early 1910s, before they tore it down for money, they were the original Florida Marlins. The Philadelphia Athletics were baseball royalty. And then to top it off, his loss in 1912 to the Boston Red Sox, that was beginning of their tear through the World Series, where they won 4 on top of each other. He was just unbelievable in those World Series, but it was not his fault. His team didn't get any run support. So that's the number 1 guy. My number 2 guy, just going to throw him back out there. Not going to spend a lot of time on because we've already talked about the man. But Babe Ruth, through 31 innings in his career in the World Series and gave up 3 earned runs. Babe Ruth, 29 and a third scoreless inning streak in the World Series. A Major League Baseball record. He went 3-0 in that stance. And because of that, I can't leave him out of the rotation. Babe Ruth helped the Boston Red Sox win the 1915, the 1916, and the 1918 World Series. Babe Ruth is my number 2 guy. My number 3 guy, I'm only going with a 3-man rotation, and then we'll put the rest of the guys in the bullpen. Mad Bum Man, Madison Bumgarner. I know that the tail end of his career was nothing to write home about, has been nothing to write home about. But Madison Bumgarner was arguably in the modern era had the most unbelievable numbers in the history of the World Series. But I'm talking modern era. I'm not talking about before the dead ball, essentially before 1920, after 1920, excuse me. What Christy Mathewson did was unbelievable. But listen to this, Bumgarner, in case you might have forget. First of all, he was the 2014 World Series MVP. You don't get that very often with pitchers. Second of all, he won 3 World Series. 3. He was 4-0 in those World Series. 4-0. Madison Bumgarner, in his career in the World Series, a .25 ERA. 36 innings, pitched just 1 earned run the whole damn time. 1 earned run. He pitched 8 innings of shutout ball in 2010 against Texas. He pitched 7 innings of shutout ball against Detroit in 2012. And then 2014, I think the one that will always go down in infamy, 21 innings of 1-run ball where he went 2-0. And oh, by the way, on short rest, mind you, short rest, had like a 5-6 inning save. What in the hell are we talking about? That in today's era, the tail end of the steroid era. Madison Bumgarner, he's it. We don't have to do a deep dive into my bullpen. Obviously, Mariano Rivera with his 11 saves, by far the greatest of the greats. But if you're going to put other guys in the bullpen, one of the guys that I do think that gets a little looked over is going to be Art Neff from 1921 to 1924. He pitched 79 innings, had a 2.16 ERA. Art Neff really doesn't get talked enough, I don't believe, in the histories of baseball. And maybe it's because he gets overshadowed. Number one, his overall career WAR is only 28, so everyone kind of overlooks him, looks him a little bit. He was very average for his time, 3.2 ERA, which was fairly high ERA for that time. But you look at what he did. Art Neff, I mean, to have a 2.16 ERA and 79 innings pitched in the World Series. He was a part of that early cog of New York baseball. Did want to make sure we mention him. And then the other guy who's got to be on my list, he just missed the top 3. And I really wouldn't have a problem with putting him in and taking Babe Ruth out and putting Babe Ruth in my bullpen. But the Babe Ruth, the 29 to 3rd scoreless innings just jumps out at you. But Bob Gibson, my all-time favorite pitcher, 7-2 with a 1.89 ERA, 81 innings pitched, 92 strikeouts. And I was lucky enough, I'll leave you with this. I was lucky enough to meet the great Bob Gibson years ago. He came into a bar that I was working at, a restaurant bar that I was doing security for in Middle Tennessee, just outside Nashville. And I'm standing at the door. I was doing IDs and whatnot. This is late afternoon, early evening. So it was before it really turns into, it was basically a cafe that it's eventually turned into a nightclub. And that's what I did. And the general manager of the place knew that this young, think I was, if I'm to guess, I would have been somewhere around 25 years old. I really don't remember how old I was, but I was right in that neighborhood. And the great Bob Gibson is sitting over and eating lunch with his lunch date. I don't know if it was his wife or whatever. I wasn't familiar with his personal life at that time. But anyways, the manager comes over and he goes, "Didn't you say you're a big baseball fan?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Do you know who that is?" I look over, and it was only because my grandfather, it was his favorite player. I recognized him immediately once he pointed it out. I said, "Damn, is that Bob Gibson?" He goes, "It is Bob Gibson." I said, "God bless." And of course, this is before camera phones and stuff. Can't take pictures. And I was like, man, I really wish I could have gotten a picture with him or something. He goes, "Go ask for his autograph." I said, "Man, I'm just not an autograph guy." I do regret that one. I wish I would have done that one, but I've never been an autograph guy. It's just something I got from my dad. It was just basically, shake a man's hand, but don't, turn him into some kind of an idol. He said, "Well, you should go over and talk to him." I said, "Man, I'm not going to bother this guy. And I didn't grow up watching him." He goes, "Man, I'm telling you, I've met him several times before. He's a nice guy, blah, blah, blah." I said, "All right." I go over and I just stuck up my hand, shook his hand. I said, "Mr. Gibson, just want you to know that grandfather, you were his favorite player or are his favorite player. My grandfather was still with us." I mean, you cannot believe how fast I ran home to tell my grandfather the story. I was so damn excited. But anyways, he said, "Well, thank you, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Obviously, you pitched a little bit before my time, but I'm a huge baseball fan. And, it's an honor to meet you," kind of thing. Is okay. Well, after he tells me thank you and whatnot, couldn't have been nicer. The dance floor that was also where we set the tables and chairs during the afternoon for people to eat lunch, we pulled those chairs back, and it was a dance floor at night. The place was called Shoeless Joe's. I think they eventually changed the name, but I don't remember it. But anyways, when they first opened, it was called Shoeless Joe's. It was a part of a nice hotel. And the dance floor, because of the name Shoeless Joe's, and they were really springboarding it off of the incredible uh, popularity of what Field of Dreams had done several years before that. And then, of course, other movies sprung off of that. So Shoeless Joe's, their dance floor slash uh, area where your dining room area, the floor was painted like a baseball field. Well, he just happened to be sitting at a table right next to home plate. I mean, he's sitting basically, if he's sitting right looking towards the door, home plate was to his right. And I started to walk off and I saw the home plate, and I don't know what made me pop this into my mind, but I said, "Mr. Gibson, before I leave, I got to ask you one thing." He said, "What's that?" I said, "What would you do if I was hanging over the plate and I acted as though I was hanging over the plate, basically crowding the plate?" I said something to the effect of, "What would you do if I was hanging over the plate?" And I got to clean up the last part, but it's one of the greatest things that ever happened in my life. He stood up, stuck his finger right in my rib, about as hard as you could ever stick your finger in someone's rib. I mean, it left a mark for a few days. Proud that he left a mark. Jammed it right in my rib. He goes, "I'd hit you right there, you M and effer bleep, whatever you want to say, because that plate belongs to me, not you." And I clapped my hands and say, "Yes, that's what I'm talking about." And he just started laughing. He says, something to the effect of, "Nice to meet you," and whatnot. And I was like, "Yes, the great Bob Gibson." So I leave you with that story. It's one of my favorites of all time. Haven't told it many times, but I'll never forget him sticking his finger right in my rib. That's my plate. Y'all have a great one, and we look forward to the next. Once Upon a Pastime series. Game 4 of this series is going to be really fun.